Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We're going to be looking at this concept of restoration
Okay.
as it's talked about in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at Alma chapter 41.
Okay, yeah.
This chapter really digs into the relationship between justice and our actions here in this life and what happens to us in the eternities.
Yeah, it's a really important chapter, especially for anyone who wants to understand God's plan for us, you know?
You know what I find really interesting is it seems like back then, just like today,
Right.
people were looking for ways to kind of, I don't know, get around the rules.
Yeah.
Alma is talking to a son, Corianton, who seems to have this idea that you could just live however you wanted,
Right.
sin without consequence,
Yeah.
and then everything would just be magically restored in the afterlife.
Oh, absolutely. That kind of thinking is always around, isn't it?
Yeah,
The idea that we can somehow escape the natural consequences of our choices.
right. But Alma sets the record straight.
He does.
In Alma 41.2, he says, the plan of restoration is requisite with the justice of God, for it is requisite that all things should be restored to their proper order. So,
What's fascinating here is that Alma is talking about a principle that goes way beyond just our individual choices.
oh, yeah.
He's talking about a universal principle of balance and order.
So it's not about getting a free pass, but about a divine justice system.
Exactly. It's about things being set right.
Okay.
Take, for example, the idea of our physical bodies being restored to our spirits after death.
Right.
Alma talks about this in Alma 41.2. It is requisite and just, according to the power and resurrection of Christ, that the soul of man should be restored to its body, and that every part of the body should be restored to itself.
Wow. Okay. So restoration in this sense means like putting things back the way they were meant to be.
Yes, and it's not just about our physical bodies, but also about the consequences of our actions, both the good and the bad.
So that's where the idea of justice comes in.
Precisely, Alma explains in Alma 41.3 that if we live righteous lives full of good works and desires, then we'll be restored to a state that reflects those choices, a state of goodness and happiness. He actually uses the word happiness in that verse.
Interesting. So our choices have a direct impact on what we experience after this life.
Absolutely, and it works both ways. If we choose evil, if we live in a carnal state, as Alma calls it, we're restored to a state that reflects those choices too.
And what does that state look like according to Alma?
Well, he doesn't sugarcoat it. In Alma 41.4, he talks about a state of endless misery, inheriting the kingdom of the devil. Those are some pretty strong words.
Yeah, those are definitely images that stick with you. Makes you think twice about the choices we make each day.
It does, and it really emphasizes the idea of personal accountability, that we're ultimately responsible for the choices we make.
And that our choices have eternal consequences for better or for worse.
Exactly. Alma really drives that point home in Alma 41.7 when he says they're their own judges, whether to do good or do evil. He's basically saying that we have agency, the power to choose our path.
But with that power to choose comes a responsibility, right?
Absolutely. And this is where the unchangeable nature of God's decrees comes into play. Alma says in Alma 41.8, the decrees of God are unalterable. He's making it clear that the path to salvation is open to all who choose to walk it, but there are also consequences for choosing a different path. And that leads us to another really important point that Alma makes.
Okay.
He says in Alma 41.10, wickedness never was happiness.
You know, I think that's a statement that a lot of people struggle with because we live in a world that often tells us the opposite.
Right.
That we can find happiness in things that aren't aligned with God's will.
It's definitely a message that goes against the grain of what our society often tells us.
Right.
But it's a profound truth, and when you really think about it, it makes sense.
Yeah.
True happiness comes from aligning ourselves with God's plan, with his eternal laws.
And what about those who choose not to align themselves with God's plan? How does Alma describe their state?
He uses some very vivid language to paint a picture of their spiritual condition in Alma 41.1. He says they're in the gall of bitterness and in the bonds of iniquity.
That's pretty intense imagery. It definitely doesn't sound like a pleasant state to be in.
It is. He's describing a state of being completely separated from God, cut off from the source of true joy and peace.
So this idea of restoration is really about consequences, isn't it? About reaping what we sow.
Exactly. It's about a natural alignment between our actions and the outcomes we experience.
Okay.
And this is where Alma gets really specific.
Okay.
He challenges this idea that restoration somehow changes the nature of things.
So he's saying it's not about God changing the rules to fit our choices.
Exactly. In Alma 41.12, he asks, is the meaning of the word restoration to take a thing of a natural state and place it in an unnatural state, or to place it in a state opposite to its nature?
That's an interesting way to put it. He's basically asking if restoration goes against the natural order of things.
Right, and he answers that question by saying that the true meaning of restoration is to bring back evil for evil, or carnal for carnal, or devilish good for that which is good, righteous for that which is righteous, just for that which is just, merciful for that which is merciful. That's from Alma 41.13.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's about a natural consequence, kind of like a spiritual law of cause and effect.
Exactly. It's about things being put back in their proper order according to God's divine justice.
Okay, so if we want to experience good things, we need to do good things.
That's what Alma is saying. He goes on to explain this in more detail in Alma 41.1415. He says, "Therefore, my son, see that you are merciful unto your brethren. Deal justly, judge righteously, and do good continually. And if you do all these things, then shall you receive your reward. Yea, you shall have mercy restored unto you again. You shall have justice restored unto you again. You shall have a righteous judgment restored unto you again. And you shall have good rewarded unto you again. For that which you do send out shall return unto you again and be restored."
This idea that what we send out comes back to us, that's a powerful concept. It really highlights the responsibility we have for our actions.
It does. And it's not just about receiving judgment. It's about actively shaping our future.
It's like we're creating the blueprint for our own restoration, whether it's a state of happiness or a state of misery.
Precisely. And Alma emphasizes this point in Alma 41.15. The word restoration more fully condemneth the sinner, and justifieth him not at all.
So there's no escaping the consequences of our choices. We can't just expect to be restored to happiness if we've lived a life contrary to God's principles.
Yeah, that's right. Restoration is about accountability and not a free pass. It's about aligning our lives with God's will and experiencing the natural consequences of those choices.
So we've been talking about this concept of restoration, and how it relates to justice and the consequences of our choices.
Right.
But I'm wondering, what does this actually look like in our lives?
Yeah.
How can we practically apply these principles?
That's a great question. It can feel a bit abstract at times, right?
Yeah.
But if we look back at Alma 41, there are actually some really clear takeaways.
Okay.
For example, remember in Alma 41.14, where Alma says, "Therefore, my son, see that you are merciful unto your brethren, deal justly, judge righteously, and do good continually." He's giving us a blueprint for living in a way that's aligned with the principle of restoration.
So it's not just about avoiding bad things, but actively doing good things.
Exactly. It's about choosing to be merciful, to act justly, to be righteous in our judgments, and to consistently strive to do good.
Okay.
And he promises, if you do all these things, then shall you receive your reward.
It's almost like we're actively participating in the process of our own restoration through the choices we make each day.
That's a really insightful way to put it. We're not just passive recipients of God's judgment,
Right.
but active agents in shaping our eternal destiny.
Yeah.
And it's a continuous process.
Okay.
Not about achieving some kind of perfection in this life,
Right.
but about consistently trying to live in a way that reflects the divine attributes we hope to be restored to.
So it's about becoming more like God, more like Christ.
Yes, it's about cultivating those Christ-like attributes.
Okay.
Mercy, justice, righteousness, and goodness in our interactions with others and in our own personal growth.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So in a way, understanding this concept of restoration can actually be incredibly motivating.
Yeah.
It reminds us that we have the power to influence our eternal outcome through the choices we make right now.
It is empowering, isn't it?
Yeah.
Knowing that we're not just at the mercy of fate, but that we have a role to play in shaping our eternal destiny. That's a really hopeful message.
It certainly is. Well, I think this has been an incredibly thought-provoking discussion
Me too.
on a topic that can sometimes feel complex and maybe even a bit intimidating.
Yeah.
But Alma chapter 41 offers such a clear and insightful perspective on this principle of restoration.
Absolutely.
I hope this conversation has given you a deeper understanding of this important doctrine and inspired you to think about how you can apply it in your own life.
I agree. It's a reminder that our choices have real and lasting consequences, and that by striving to live in harmony with God's principles, we can actively participate in the process of our own restoration, moving toward that state of ultimate happiness and fulfillment that God desires for each of us.
If you'd like to hear more discussions like this, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.